Well, Jeff, you you and I have often talked about the impact of the 3 years we had together, the 2 in Iran and then this trip afterwards, and what the impact of all of that has been. And as that's been not an easy question for us, either one of us, I think, to try to spell out in a clear fashion. But as I tried to do it the other day, I finally said, well, the reason I think it's partially challenging is that there were a lot of things that were contributing to all this. So I finally sat down and tried to tease some of that out and separate. So here's what I'm going to do is talk first just about the trip itself, the last year, the 3 years that were related so closely, and what that was for me, and then move on to some of the other pieces of that bigger picture. Because I've said often, and it really is true, that those 3 years, without a question, changed me and reshaped me into the kind of person I've been since then, more than any other event or period in my life. And so it really was huge. So what was behind all that? So this is my attempt to answer some of that. First of all, just to focus on the trip, I think the biggest impact of that whole trip, there were multiple things, and I'll mention some of the others, but the biggest impact for me clearly was the world was my home now, not just the U.S. And part of what I mean by that is I care about what happens in the rest of the world. I care about what happens to people elsewhere. I care about people from other parts of the world that I happen to encounter here or elsewhere. I am an American, of course, that's where I grew up, and I have identity there, but my real identity is much broader than that. I really do feel like all these places that I look at when I look at this globe, and I love looking at it, that whole thing is my home now, and not just one country in it. In addition to that redefinition of my identity and what's home for me, is that trip really ignited something that was there before, but just by giving full expression to it, expanded my interest in travel, somewhat the U.S., but especially world travel. And I've been extraordinarily fortunate between various things in my life, including that consulting I mentioned, of having the opportunity to revisit basically every region of the world in the last 15 years with this consulting. But I enjoyed it because I knew part of this, and this was visiting other parts of my home, if you will. Right. So that big interest in world travel. The other part of it, though, I think, is that an interest in exciting new adventures. That whole trip was such an adventure. We had half a sense of what we were getting to, but only half a sense. And there were always things coming up that were new, unexpected, and sometimes challenging. But we did it, and we learned we could deal with challenges. And it was exciting. And so, other challenges that are professional or this kind of challenge or even social challenges are not as overwhelming or daunting as they would have been otherwise, because, hey, these are fun. Let's figure out how to deal with that. And so that, I think, the trip had a big impact on it. And then the last one is, I think it increased, and this is related to what I just said, I guess, but it increased my tolerance for taking risks. And I've had so many people over my life from time to time say, Fink, you're a risk taker. And I'd look at what they were referring to, and I said, risk? What risk? My life's not at stake in this situation, whereas it has been in other situations. Cobra right down there. That wasn't really risky, but things like that. And but it basically allows me to reassess the magnitude of a risk, and if it's not life-threatening, it's not really a serious one. It may be risk involved when you want to think about that, but I'm not risk averse like I might have been, like other people I think are. So all of those things I think came directly from the trip part of those 3 years I was talking to. But then as I thought more about it, what I also realized that the other things that happened to me was what the trip itself added to what got started in Iran. And so when you take those 3 things, those 3 years together, one of the things that happened for me, and even more so with a lot of what happened to you after the trip, was it educated me and us about the challenges facing developing countries. I know for me, when I was in Iran, I saw a number of things that looked like the Iranians were doing that kind of quirky. They just didn't do this right and didn't make sense and didn't follow that. But on this trip, we went through all these other countries and found other countries doing the same thing. And then I realized it wasn't an Iranian thing, it was something you will tend to find in a developing country, and there were reasons why that was there. And so that it really helped me understand developing countries, and that Iran was part of that. The other big thing the 3 years did was broaden my religious views. And as you know, I went into, I was in college intending to be a Lutheran minister and even a missionary, and part of my reason for going into Peace Corps was to see if I wanted to really be a missionary or just be a minister back in the States. But what happened both in Iran, got started in Iran, but also got, again, expanded with the trip, was encountering Muslims who were sincere, God-loving people because of their religion. And then we went on the trip and discovered the same thing with Hinduism and Buddhism and Jain religion and the Sikhs and the tribal religions of Africa and things like that. And I found there were really good people, spiritually motivated people in all of these religions. And it made me realize I couldn't just look at Christianity as a uniquely good religion. And that forced me to change my views about what I wanted to do in my life vis-a-vis Christianity versus other religion. So it really broadened my religious views. And the other thing that you've mentioned so often in your comments, it of course expanded our sense of history. You know, in the United States, we think of something as really old if it's 100 years old or 150 years old, and then we get over right off the bat to Iran and on this country, and you're dealing with civilizations that have been around for 3,000, 5,000, 8,000 years, and it just, the things that you need, the historical events that you need to know about to understand the world and even parts of the world is much greater than 100, 150 years. And so it expanded my sense of the history of the world that I want to know about. The other kind of sign of serendipitously was when I came back from both the Peace Corps in Iran, or the trip, and came back to this, was in my home territory for a year there teaching school at Beecher City, was I really got on the public speaking tour, if you will. People knew I was back, and I had been writing letters about all my experiences to the local newspaper, so they knew me as somebody who was having these incredible adventures. And so when they found out that I was back, I started getting invitations from hunting groups or Rotary groups, church groups, and others to come and tell the story of what either Iran or the trip or both. And I found out that I enjoyed doing that. That is, I enjoyed being an entree, if you will, to the world for these people that probably wouldn't have the chance to travel that I had just had in an incredible way. So I got halfway okay at showing slides and telling a story like that, and a little bit like what we're doing on this website, that I enjoyed doing that and had an opportunity to try to develop and hone my skills a little bit. And so there was the trip plus the 2 years in Iran. The other two things that I think are important in that 3-year period was during the trip itself. This is the third thing I was talking about, is for me, this happened for both of us, but our association with Will Louden, the guy who was on the trip, a little older than we were, more mature, had already had some development. He was about 15 years older than we were. But he, in essence, in many ways became a role model for me, because there were so many things about him that I admired and that were admirable, and it was his incredibly wide range of abilities. He was an outstanding photographer. He was a rancher, a lifelong, and never lost the love for doing that. He was a geologist. He was an archaeologist, an incredible artist that really developed later in his life. Reader, philosopher, teacher at that junior college that you were at for a while. And I just looked at that and said, how can one guy be so good in so many different, really different from one another things? They were just, I mean, from a photographer to an artist to an archaeologist, I mean, the philosopher and thinker and all that stuff. And so it encouraged me to, I never was a master of so many things as he was, but it prompted me to try to be good in more than one thing, and is whatever talents I could find in myself to try to develop those. But the other thing that he really had a big impact on me is I was more of a, grew up as because I was an only child, but I felt limited in my ability to engage people socially and comfortably and easily. I just didn't know how to be a good conversationalist with somebody I didn't previously know. And Will was so good at that. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
just watched him for a whole year go,
Yeah.
all these places we met, and people
Yeah.
took us in, and he would just so easily flow into questions. But what he did, that I learned, he knew the kinds of questions to ask that would get them talking, and then we'd learn from them. And so that really left an impact on me, is to try to learn how to do that. I'm not sure I ever became the master of it that he was, but I certainly saw what value that had, and that to whatever degree I could develop that skill, I learned that from Willard. Well, and the final thing that I think is worth mentioning here, that I finally was able to separate out, but it was part of the whole 3 years, was just 3 years being with you. We were together basically 24/7
Right.
in Iran, and 24/7 on the trip, and didn't know each other at all before we got assigned to the school in Ahwaz. I mean, we were in the training program, but we weren't close friends. That wasn't something that happened there. That happened after we got to Iran. And there were several things that have had an impact. My association with you has had an impact on me. Of course, the big one is your long, natural love of geography. I mean, I think you've been of all the geographers I've ever known, you've had the most intuitive, innate love of it. And I've often joked about you. I said, when I talk to other people about it, I said, Jeff is the kind of guy that I swear when he was born, he came out of his mother's womb with an atlas in hand, already working at it. You got started early on working on this stuff, but you have a love for it. And one of the early impacts of that was when we were in Iran, and we would go to a grocery store or something to do some shopping. And I would go in there saying, well, where's the milk, where's the meat, the bread, or whatever? And you'd go in there, where's this coming from? Where's this coming from? Where's this coming? And all of a sudden, I said, why would you want to know that? And all of a sudden, I saw you start to build up these networks of where it came from here, and all these networks around the world that are going on. And I just never even was aware of thinking about that, and that it might have value. And that clearly came from you. But the other thing is that love of geography that I developed from you from the whole 3 years was really what prompted me to ask if I could teach that course in geography when I got to Beecher City. Because I ordinarily would have said, well, she was teaching Lingus math, that's what I'll do, period. But no, I said, I'd like to teach some geography, partly because of the trip, but partly because you got me excited about geography. And so when I returned, and then of course, having taught it there and having gone to that institute, and then that led to my deciding to go into graduate school, not just in education, but in geography, and looking at the teaching of geography. And of course, you're routing me to Chicago, which turned out to be a wonderful place for me to go and get my degree there. You were critical, and your love of geography was behind all of that. The other two things, one is you and I have a little bit different personality. There's a lot of overlap, which is why we've had such a great relationship. But part of what I've gotten from you is you're very serious about things that are worth being taken seriously. And I've tried to develop that in myself not that it was the first two, I just hadn't developed it, but once I saw what you did with that, I enjoyed making that a part of my persona, if you will. And the final thing that maybe people have seen here somewhat in this videotaping for this website project, you have a wonderfully subtle sense of humor that I really enjoy. I enjoy it in Iran, I enjoyed it on the trip, and I think to some degrees there's a couple of people that have different kinds of sense of humor that I've met in my life that I enjoy being a little bit of a sponge. But my wife can tell you I have a lot of your sense of humor in what I do around the home here with that. So a lot of that has coming through, but because we had 3 years together between Iran and this trip. So all of that together is kind of the way I would sum up the impact of those 3 years. But and they were all related to both the trip and Iran and you and Willard. So thank you for your part in that.
That's welcome.
Yeah.